Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We have Dr. Courtney Brown tonight on our show. We're going to be discussing the 911 remote viewing sessions that him and people that he has been working with for years had the opportunity to do. You can check out Courtney's work at courtneybrown.com or farsight.org. Courtney, thank you very much for joining us tonight. How are you doing?
Hey, Rex, it's my great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you so much for inviting me back on.
It is an absolute pleasure to have you here. Every time you come on the show, you blow my mind, and I'm sure everybody that's listening to the show as well. One thing tonight that is really, I'm sure, powerful and sketched in many of our hearts and minds is the events of 911. A lot of people feel that it was, global conspiracy that was an inside job, a false flag. And then there's many people that feel that the, inside sources just couldn't do such a thing, that it would just be unfathomable. So one of the things that I was really impressed with that I had the opportunity to watch the preview on your website on farsight.org of the two-part episodes that you have done. And you kind of did this to quell the rumors, right? I mean, you wanted to do this session to say, hey, look, this really wasn't an inside job. This was, some terrorists out there that had our worst interests in mind. But you came up with something completely different, didn't you?
Yeah, actually, that was exactly what happened. I mean, I saw the events on TV just like everybody else, and I just assumed that it was what it was. But there were conspiracy theorists out there, and I didn't really take them very seriously. But when I started getting these remote viewing sessions done by Dick Algire and Daz Smith, who are the arguably the two best remote viewers on the planet right now, I wrote up the targets and I controlled the study, and I knew there was no information leaks. They did it totally blind, and they were both coming in with identical information. I had to, I've long learned to believe information that I get by myself, that I get myself, rather than things that people tell me. It's amazing, Rex, at how much information is out there that is simply wrong, that people lie. People actually, I'm not talking about just 9/11, I'm talking about so many things. If you were to actually try to figure out what's happening anywhere in the world by listening to what people tell you, there is no way in the world that you could figure out what's going on. It's just such a common phenomenon for especially leadership within serious places to lie in order to advance their own agenda. There is really no incentive to simply speak the truth. There's always, what story could I say that would give me the result that I want? That's always what's playing in the mind of people, from going back to the ancient days of the Knights of the Round Table, all the way up to the present, and probably going back to the beginning of time. It's like you just can't believe anybody. So revelation, when you're being told something, is really worthless on almost any subject that you can name. Finding out firsthand what actually did happen, it really is the only game in town if you really want to know what actually happened. Anyway, the 9/11 story was tremendously complicated, and it was a real showstopper for me. I mean, I had to sit down and sort of grip myself. It was such a big deal. I mean, it was so complicated to pull that off that it was very difficult to imagine somebody going through all that. But it was so sloppy also. Once I started getting the remote viewing data coming in, then I started to seriously investigate what these so-called conspiracy theorists had been saying, especially the architects and engineers group, the 9/11 truthers, the pilots that formed their own groups for 9/11 stuff. I started to listen to what they were saying in detail, and the amount of sloppiness that went on is just enormous. And there's leaks. There's all types of evidence is pointing to the idea that it wasn't just a bunch of crazy Islamic terrorists that did something, but that there was an orchestrated deal that was much bigger than that. And when you put it all together, it's sort of hard to come to grips with the enormity of the matter. But yeah, that's what happened. I had to face that, and you have to understand that the regular American people haven't, the world public hasn't come to grips with that either. So if I thought what I was facing was difficult. The world is still to face that. I mean, most people, I would say most people, well, actually, they did a survey recently. I think something that's up to 30 or 40% believe that 9/11 was an inside job. So it's
That's
actually
pretty
growing.
substantial.
Yeah, it's pretty substantial.
Well, we had the opportunity here at Disclosure Media to interview Richard Gage, and he
Yeah.
is, head of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Very nice guy. You could tell he really is doing his very best to just get to the truth of the matter. And, we talked about certain things that you certainly aren't going to hear about in the mainstream news networks. So, what were some of your findings? Obviously, there were four planes, or four supposed planes that crashed into these towers, and then the Pentagon. A lot of people feel that it was actually a missile that hit the Pentagon, and it's quite peculiar. The people that did get killed, from the information I've done, they were actually auditing, certain records. The people that were in that attack of the Pentagon, anyway. And there's a lot of research where certain that I've done, and supposedly people were warned not certain people were warned not to go to work, on 911 at the Twin Towers. So then you've got Tower 7 that collapses within its own footprint. So what could you tell us, Courtney, about the events and what happened, man?
Well, this project is different from all of our other projects in this significant way. We have two of the best remote viewers on the planet using military or military derived methodologies. But the military methods for remote viewing were done using paper and pen. And a couple projects in the past, the Atlantis project, Dick Algeier, who was a celebrity newscaster in Hawaii for like 30 years, he was more comfortable in front of a camera without a camera in front of him. And so he said, "Well, let me do one of these sessions on video." And so he did it and sent it in, and I was quite resistant. I always find myself sort of in embarrassing situations eventually like that. And then I looked at it though and I said, "This is great." And so we actually put it in the video release for the Atlantis project. And then we did the next project, which was the origins of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And so we decided to say, let's try this with two viewers, Dick Algeier and Daz Smith in Britain. Dick Algeier's in Hawaii. And let's do half paper and pen and then half video. Well, it turned out to be so great, having Daz and Dick do their sessions live under totally blind conditions and coming up with those results. Were very detailed descriptions of how the pyramids were built, and they had no idea what the targets or project was all about. They were doing under totally blind conditions, yet they were both drawing these pyramids perfectly, and how the construction was put together. So for this project, for the 9/11 project, we just said, well, let's toss out the paper and pen completely and just use the paper and pen sessions for warm-up sessions and make this a video project. So essentially all important information is recorded live on video. So when we did this project, we had two things in mind. The first is to unravel what happened with the September 11 attacks. And I originally thought this would be a good sort of validation type project. We know what happened, we saw it there, and then the remote viewing will be really good, and it'll confirm the governmental story, and then we'll be off and running. And it'll show that remote viewing works. And that was sort of the reason for doing this project originally. But when the results came in, I said, well, never have expectations going into a remote viewing project. You never know what you're going to get. And so this was all done live on video. Now, one of the reasons I'm saying this before actually telling sort of stuff about what actually we found was because this was so shocking. It was really great we did it all live on video because we produced two documentaries, both, running close to 4 hours. And they're both about 2 hours long. And the first one deals with the World Trade Center attacks and Building 7, which is a smaller, but that was the original World Trade Center back in the old days. And so there were 3 buildings that collapsed. And then the second video is about the Pentagon attack and the overall organization of those who orchestrated both the New York and Washington, D.C. attacks. So there we are with these videos showing it. And the reason I'm saying it's so important to actually see the videos is because the story is so unbelievable that you have to see it with your own eyes. And fortunately, you can see it with your own eyes, meaning you actually see Dick Algar and Daz Smith describe exactly what happened with the 9/11 story, but they also tell the backstory. You see the buildings collapse. Had no idea what the project or target was about, but they describe everything perfectly. And when they describe the backstory with the guys arriving in jumpsuits, in vans in the middle of the night, lacing the buildings with explosives, I mean, it's just startling. And when you see the Pentagon stuff, which we can talk about again, more about, and find out it was a missile, not a plane, and that then you look at all the anomalous physical evidence, you realize that everything that's anomalous and physical matches with the remote viewing data, but it doesn't match with the governmental story, the official, what some people call the official conspiracy theory. And so the thing is that when you hear what happens, it's one thing. Me telling you what happens is one thing. But when you see it live, it's a whole nother thing. You know, when you have an eyewitness report in a court case, think about what you're doing. You're in a court case and you have lawyers grilling a eyewitness. Now, the eyewitness is trying to remember what she or he saw. Remote viewing is different because when you remote view, you're actually witnessing it in real time right there. And since it was caught on video, standing up in front of whiteboards, fully engaging with the camera, the viewers describe not what they remembered they saw, but what they are seeing right then and there. So you as the audience actually know what the target is and know what the project is all about. But you're looking at viewers that don't know, yet they're describing everything perfectly. It adds a level of credibility that has never been achieved before. So there are two reasons to actually watch the video. The first is to find out what happened with the 9/11 incident. The second is to see what happens when you have really world-class remote viewers do this type of thing. You see them describe all the verifiable components, and then you hear them say they're trained to sort of investigate. So they went in to the building, saw what happened, went back in time, saw the explosives being laid in. They saw the planes. They went into the cockpits to see what was going on at the plane. I mean, you get the backstory that you never got with the news media. And that is really astounding. So for this interview, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about the remote viewing data as if it's just the reality. So just understand that I'm doing it from the perspective of the remote viewing data. And so I'm not going to keep saying the words from the perspective of the remote viewing data, but that's what it is. Meaning, I'm forgetting what the media has told people. I'm forgetting what other people have said. I'm just saying from the perspective of what the remote viewing data say, this is what the story actually happens. So let me ask you, Rex, where do we want to begin? Do we want to begin in New York or do you want to begin in Washington with the Pentagon building?
Well, I would like to begin with New York. Obviously, there was four planes, so there was Flight 77, Flight 11, Flight 175, and one of the things that blows my mind is the numerology behind these what I like to call false flags or these giant catastrophes. It seems like the dates that they choose, the specific numbers of the flights,
Yeah,
etc.,
yeah,
all
yeah,
have
yeah,
some
yeah.
type of numerological significance. So, but yeah, let's get into New York City first, the Twin Towers, then Tower 7, and then maybe we could discuss the Pentagon and the flight that was supposed to hit DC, Flight 93, that didn't make it.
Sure. Well, let me just say that all the background information for what I'm going to be talking about, which is the targets themselves, is available on our website, which is www.farsight.org, FARSIGHT, like seeing far.org, O-R-G, because we're a nonprofit. And right on the homepage, you'll see a big huge picture banner for the 9/11 project. Just click that and you go to our 9/11 page, and you'll see all the targets. Scroll down, you'll see all the targets. And so the targets are the things that the remote viewers were supposed to perceive. Now, they were not told what these targets are, of course. They were written and they were designed by me, but just held on my computer. Data Smith was in Britain and Hawaii was Dick Elgire, and they're on opposite sides of the planet. They had no communication between them, and they were under totally blind conditions, not knowing anything other than an email from me saying, there is a target, just, do a session, send it to me. So
So
they did pay.
real quick, Courtney, when you do that, when you send them those emails saying that there's a target I want you to remote view for me, do you send them like a letter or a number or
No,
a pattern?
nothing. All I tell them is that there are 7 targets for the project, and start with the first one. And the first one, it was project number 10, so it was 10A. So I said, start with 10A. So they do a paper and pen session. That's it. They're just told there's a target, 10A, do it. In
That's
fact,
it.
I purposely avoided, actually number 9 was next in the list. And I purposely avoided using number 9. I jump around with the numbers, meaning we had the one we had done earlier was a number 7. So we had an 8 and a 9 that was coming up. And I said, I don't want to get close to an 8, and let's just jump over to number 10. So I went to 10. Because I just wanted to, and before that I had done a 4. I mean, so we jump around completely. But the number I was avoiding was 9 because of the 9/11. So I wanted to, just give them a 10. I mean, they had done 4, they had done 7, back and forth jumping around, and this one was 10. So I said, there's target A, 10A, do that. That's it. Nothing more, Rex. Nothing. And so they do a paper and pen session, and then I say, okay, 10B. That's all they're told, 10B. And they do a paper and pen session, send it in. And after I got like 10C, I started asking them to do video sessions on these things. So they would do typically a session for one of these things, and I'd say, okay, now this is all with an email. Okay, now continue this session on video. And so the paper and pen sessions were basically just warm-ups to get them started on a target. Now, let me describe what the targets were. And again, all of this is described in detail in the videos for the project, and you can see all about that right on at farsight.org, the webpage. So the first project, and the videos are available both as DVDs and video on demand. So, it's totally accessible to people. So the first target, target 10A, was what caused the collapse of Building 7. Now, most people know about the Twin Towers coming down. They've seen that on TV. But a lot of people don't know there was another building that came down called Building 7, which was the original World Trade Center. And that's where it's a really well-constructed building, and that's where the command center for emergency command center for the mayor for all of New York is based. So if there was a emergency in New York, that's where the mayor is supposed to go. Really nicely fortified building. Now, Building 7, modern architecture, old building, came down. It was never hit by a plane. It did catch on fire, and never in the history of modern architecture ever has a office furniture fire collapsed a building. Yet Building 7 collapsed.
Exactly.
And Building 7 collapsed on its own footprint in a manner that was absolutely exactly what's supposed to happen with a controlled demolition.
Right.
And that's what the A&E people with Richard Gage, that's what they mostly talk about. They mostly talk about the Building 7 collapse, because that is such a marked departure from what would be expected. They've got a whole bunch of architects, like 3,000 architects, engineers, first responders, things like that, that say, look, that office furniture fire simply cannot bring down a building, let alone
Right.
instantly on its own footprint. We do that. We demolish buildings, and we know how that's done, and that's what happened. So that's what they've been saying for a long time. Anyway, so we did that. We did that as a target, and I was sort of curious, but I assumed that somehow collapsed, like the internal structure collapsed, and it was sort of an odd thing. But anyway, that's how it turned out. It turned out to be that what brought down Building 7 was the same thing that brought down the Twin Towers. Anyway, Target 10B was the cause of the vertical pancaking collapse of the South Tower, which is number 2 World Trade Center. So the South Tower and the North Tower, they both collapsed in a pancaking fashion with the top going down right on their own footprint. And 10C was the North Tower. So the first 3 targets for this project, 10A, 10B, and 10C, were Building 7, the South Tower, and the North Tower. And so I had the remote viewers go into those sessions, basically just telling them there's a target, sending me the stuff, and then they did it on video, and they sent me the video. And so the concern initially was are these video sessions going to be something that are interesting enough for people to watch? So, excuse me. So that was the initial concern. And because we had never done such a full deal on just video sessions, it turned out to be that they were extraordinary and that the sessions were in such detail and so gripping. You're actually watching an eyewitness watch it for the first time. And you could see that the eyewitnesses, Dick Elgar and Dad Smith, didn't know what the target was, but they were trying to figure it out by looking at it with remote viewing. And it's absolutely gripping. So even though the documentary has 2 parts, each one's 2 hours, I've not heard a single person say that they did anything other than sit at the edge of their seat the entire time. In fact, people have said they watched the first one late at night and were assuming they would just try to get through it, and then the second one they'd watch on another day. I haven't heard of anybody who successfully did that, meaning as soon as they get to the first one, they literally can't stop, and they start the second one, and they go to bed at 4 in the morning. I mean, it's just gripping the entire. We didn't know how absolutely, mind riveting watching performance class remote viewing live on video, standing up in front of whiteboards could be until we did this. So this is a new frontier for how to do remote viewing. No longer are we doing the paper and pen stuff by itself. Now we're doing, stuff like this and even more advanced. So anyway, so what we have is these targets. The 2 basic elements that both Dad Smith and Dick Elgar went into was the buildings themselves and how they were brought down. There were explosives involved in them. And then the second thing we went into, we had a session where Dick Elgar went into one of the planes. So we're not saying that there were not planes, and we're not saying that there were not terrorists on the planes. But what we are saying is, from the perspective of these remote viewing data, that the terrorists at best were bit players. Basically, what the data clearly show is that this was an inside job. It may have had terrorists involved in it, but the way was being cleared for the terrorists. It looked like the biggest concern that the people had who were orchestrating the thing was that the terrorists might not fly very well. I mean, they were basically imbeciles. They're idiots with the minimal flight skills. And they were supposed to fly these planes dead on and hit the World Trade Centers. Now, you may think, well, how can they miss the World Trade Centers? They're so big. But, Rex, I'm a pilot. And let me tell you, it is not easy flying planes when you don't have a lot of experience to dead on hit things like that.
Well, what's more difficult than that? I just want to interject real quick. I mean, something 100 times more difficult than that would be to directly hit the Pentagon with an airplane the way that they supposedly did it, right?
Yeah. When we get to the Pentagon, we can talk about that. But it's not possible for a jumbo jet to do what that did at the Pentagon. So, but the point is, one of Dick Elgar's sessions where he describes, and you see the session live on video. You actually see him go into the cockpit and say, "What's this? Look, there's a pilot there," and it was a regular pilot. It wasn't a terrorist. And he perfectly describes something that was called that is called, but he didn't know existed at the time, uninterruptible autopilot. Meaning the planes were flying themselves. Meaning there was nothing the pilot could do. He was flipping switches. He was trying to grab the yoke. Nothing worked. Now, that's called uninterruptible autopilot. Now, that's been available commercially since December 2006 when the patents were filed. However, it's been available for military installations long before that. and it would have been a piece of cake for that stuff to be installed over a weekend to some planes back in the 2001. So the idea is that from one of these remote viewing sessions, it was very clear that the terrorists weren't even at the controls. They may have been on the plane. I'm not saying that, but with at least one of the planes, the pilot was trying to control the thing and couldn't fly the plane. Nothing would work, and that includes the radio system.
Which flight
So
was that you went into?
we that was Dick Allgaier, and I don't remember offhand which exact flight he was looking. We that is a
Okay.
that's in the documentary.
Okay.
It's either it's the South Tower or the North Tower, and I forget which one, but it's clearly done in the described in the documentary which one he was going after at that particular time. But anyway, so we're not saying that the planes didn't intersect the twin towers, but what we're saying is that the whole story of what actually happened was much different. Now, with regard to Building 7, you actually have to watch people, for example, like Daz Smith, describe the guys in jumpsuits in vans showing up in the middle of the night, like after the janitorial staff left 3 in the morning, but before the AAA personalities show up at 6. And get into the buildings and lace the buildings with explosives. Now, that's not just Building 7, but also the Twin Towers. All the major structural supports had that done as well. Now, Dick Allgaier also had a session where a couple sessions actually, where he was describing that there looks like there was nuclear elements as well. Now, that does not mean that the buildings were brought down just by nuclear stuff or just by chemical stuff, but the evidence from these remote viewing data seemed to suggest that there was both a nuclear component and chemical explosive of a normal type. Well, not really normal, but in the sense of not nuclear. And so, because not only did the buildings come down suddenly and they were so tall, but there was also an issue of metal melting. There were some of the first responders described literally streams of molten steel, like a foundry at the base. And the pile of rubbish, of wreckage, I mean, the buildings, that should have been like a 30-story tall pile of wreckage. It all collapsed down to the base, and there was a crater. So there was no,
Right.
the wreckage was gone. I mean, so
Melted
there
for
was,
months.
it was melted, vaporized, pulverized into dust, and so that took enormous explosive force. That's not the collapse of a building. That's explosive force that melts steel, vaporizes the concrete and the steel, blasted into particulate matter with liquid metal in it. So that takes tremendous explosive force. Now, Dick Allgaier actually detected radiation at the base when all the wreckage was done. He said it was low level, could be picked up by a Geiger counter, but most people, when they hear that, say, well, that's so stupid because, a big bomb, they think Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the people who act that way or say that, they just simply don't know about modern nuclear weaponry. Modern nuclear weaponry has advanced a tremendous amount since the old days. They have very small, what they call suitcase-sized nuclear weapons that well, I'll explain one that you know about. When a hydrogen bomb is detonated, it is actually detonated with a very small atomic weapon. So an atomic bomb goes off, and that detonates the hydrogen bomb. So these atomic bombs that detonate the hydrogen bombs, those are really small. But now in the old days, these atomic bombs used to be covered with a casing of uranium. Well, they don't do that anymore. That casing of uranium is what makes it so dirty. That's what makes the Hiroshima bomb so dirty. That's what makes the Nagasaki bomb so dirty. All that raw uranium just being
Right.
splattered all over the place. So that's not how they make these particular atomic weapons anymore. So that when these atomic weapons go off, there is no uranium casing, and the level of radiation, residual radiation afterwards, is very very small. So the old dirty style nuclear weaponry that you're thinking about, just toss that out of your mind. There's been tremendous advances since then. Bombs don't work like that anymore. And so it looks like there might have been a nuclear detonation at the base of Building 7, possibly at the base of the two Twin Towers. but also chemical explosions, explosives on the top going down. So when the buildings were collapsing, Building 7, building the twin, actually, especially the Twin Towers and the South Towers, they came down from the top down in a regular orchestrated fashion. And so it looks like there was explosives going all the way down to the base. Now, for those people who say that's like crazy, that's impossible, well, just think about this. Let's pick a floor. The things are 108 stories tall. Pick one, 20, let's say. Now, floor number 20 and below, they were strong enough to hold the 80 plus floors above them. They were like incredibly strong. Now, when the thing was pancaking down, when it got to floor number 20, there was no more weight on top of 20. There was no more weight. All those floors were gone. Why did floor 20 break? Why did it collapse? There was nothing above it. Then you go down to floor number 1. Why the heck did floor number 1 collapse? Then why did even that go down so it went into the basement? Why? These things can't
Right.
keep on collapsing. Those bottom floors were strong enough to hold all the upper floors. So, and for them to come down vertically, there was a big issue. So the remote viewing data clearly say that there were explosives, and the explosives went off in an orchestrated fashion to bring everything down in a nice, neat, tidy fashion, so it comes right down at the base. But something else went on, explosive went on to vaporize, melt, explode into particulate matter the actual buildings at the base, so that there was a rubble pile, but it was minuscule compared to what it should have been, and there was a crater for all these buildings. And you're not supposed to have a crater. You're supposed to have a 30-story pile of junk.
Right.
You're not supposed to have a crater. And so anyway, so that's what actually happened. So the official story that the planes brought the building down is just not right. The planes didn't bring the buildings down. Other explosive. Now, I'm not saying that the planes didn't. I'm not saying that flying objects did not hit the buildings. No, I saw it on TV just like you saw it on TV. Flying objects hit those buildings. I'm just saying that those flying objects didn't bring the buildings down, according to these remote viewing data. And in fact, when you look at the way modern architecture works and you look at the pictures of what actually happened, the video of what actually happened, the official story that the planes brought those buildings down just simply doesn't make any sense at all, especially with Building 7 that didn't have a plane break into it. You just had it collapse by itself because of an office furniture fire. Well, I'm sorry, office furniture fires have never done that in the history of any modern architectural building, any
Have
on
you
the
s-
entire planet.
have you
And
seen the
Building
video?
7, yeah, of course. And Building 7 was one of the strongest in New York. I mean,
Right.
it was the command center for all of New York should there be a problem. I mean, it was a really well constructed building. It wasn't shoddy. And for it to collapse instantly on its own footprint, that was a big deal. But that's one thing to actually talk about it from the forensic point of view, like what Richard Gage does when he talks about the evidence with regard to the physical data. It's another thing to say, but we have an eyewitness now. We have we have multiple eyewitnesses that are seeing it live, recorded on video, and going back in time and sorting it all out. We even have a good session all live on video, where you actually have Dick Algar going into what's like a uh, NSA facility in the East Coast, where all of this is being orchestrated, where all of this is being followed, and plan A, plan B, plan C, backup plans are all being done, and where they're actually following this. And it's a heavily shielded facility, and the shielding actually was not just electromagnetic for like radio and stuff like that, but they had actually imposed remote viewing shielding, which, by the way, does exist. There are ways to shield a set of targets for remote viewing as well. The only
I've
issue,
heard a little bit about that. How was that done exactly?
well, it's a very interesting technique. It actually takes a lot of effort. We actually have ways to get around it. So as soon as we discovered that it was going on, I was actually delighted. I said, "Oh wow, this is great! That means we're on to something," because we had ways of getting around it. But most people don't have ways of getting around it. So, but we had ways of getting around it. So, but the basic idea is what they do is they create what they call the mask. That means that they see targets are essentially mental constructs. You're telling mentally a remote viewer to go to a certain spot. Well, military people who are trained in this actually spend a huge amount of time creating what's called a mask, which is an overlay on top of the actual target, which would be the NSA facility or the thing that looks like an NSA facility, some type of facility. On top of that, they have another. For example, what they typically do and things like that is they actually have a map of the actual target they want shielded, and they put that on a table. And then they put a large clear, it's a big map, and then they put a large clear piece of paper on top of that map. And then they draw on that clear piece of paper another target. So that other target, it could be the Vatican, it could be whatever, but that other target is at point from point to point to point on the real target, which is the facility, is being mapped to this other target. So this other target, which is on top of the facility that they're trying to shield, also has a large map, say, of the Vatican or some other place. And so right on top of St. Patrick's, well, actually right on top of the, what's the Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel? Right on top of the Sistine Chapel would be, say, for example, I'm just using this as an example, would be on top of the Sistine Chapel would be, say, a radar facility. So in the radar set of structures, and so the radar set of structures would be right on top of the Sistine Chapel. And so what these shielders do, these people who are actually doing this, they actually mentally focus on the Sistine Chapel as being the target or the thing that's linked to that spot. And they spend a lot of time. So you have a lot of people a number of people doing that. So essentially what you have is you have a large number of people having a concentrated mental effort to associate the Sistine Chapel with that radar component. So you have a mentally constructed idea. So when people go to the facility, what they do is they find a large group of people having matched up the radar structures with the Sistine Chapel. So you get the Sistine Chapel mixed in with the radar structures. And then a lot of the remote viewers end up describing, say, the Sistine Chapel. So when you send them to the target, whatever it is, something that may have that radar thing, what they'll actually end up doing is either describing the Sistine Chapel because it's more describable, it's more in your face than the radar structures. The radar structures have antennas and stuff like that, but the Sistine Chapel is a big building with lots of people around. And so the remote viewers sort of go to that component. So it sort of draws them off track. And then if they're really good remote viewers, they'll end up blending the two targets. So you'll get something that looks like the Sistine Chapel with radar all over it. so, I mean, that's what actually happens. So we have ways around that. And so as soon as we found out that blocking had gone on, and we have not experienced blocking since like 1997. So it was a real eureka experience. It was really, actually, for us, this is the best way to
What were they blocking back then?
Back in 1970, we had another public demonstration of remote viewing, and they agency people had actually done the same thing to a different type of blocking procedure, but very similar in the sense that of drawing the viewers off. See, the viewers normally go off in a flock as a group to these targets, so they're sort of used to sort of honing in on something that sort of lights up out there. And if you have other viewers that are designed to sort of distract them, go in prior and sort of set up sort of like the lights over here, or they can draw you off and so on. So we hadn't had anything like that happen since 1997. And when it happened again for this project, I was like, consider it like a teenage hacker that finally got into the big corporate structures that he was trying to get into, the servers and so on like that. And finally he got through all the firewalls. That's the type of eureka, though, the adrenaline that because these teenage hackers, they don't do it for money. They just do it for the excitement. So that's the type of excitement that we had, or that I had, when we found out there was remote viewing blocking going on. I said, so this is great. We haven't had that forever. I'm just like so fun. And so I instituted the anti-blocking procedures, and they blasted right through it, and they went right to the underlying target. And there was the whole facility, and it was really fascinating to go in there. And then Dick Algeier, in the actual session that you see live on the video, he describes the blocking. He describes all this shielding. He said, "This is the most heavily shielded thing I've ever seen. There's not only camouflage on the top, but there's radar, there's electromagnetic shielding, Faraday type cages every place, and they even have remote viewing blocking going on here. This is weird." So it was just really so fun from my perspective of doing something like this to actually run into all that. So that was really great. I mean, that was a real sort of interesting sort of high point. But anyway, so we have those towers coming down, and at least one of the planes had uninterruptible autopilot engaged. And at least one of the planes didn't have terrorists actually flying it, but actually had it was flying by itself, and there was an actual original pilot still at the controls in the uniform and everything, and unable to do anything at all about it, including use the radio. I mean, nothing in the cockpit worked. And that's exactly what uninterruptible autopilot does. Now, uninterruptible autopilot has actually been installed in a lot of planes, and you've probably flown on some planes that have it. So some modern jets actually have it, and the airlines buy it in order to protect themselves against hijacking. So if anything should happen, they can take over the plane and land it. So the patents were filed in December of 2006. However, you don't file a patent if you have sensitive military technology until you're willing to let other people have it, because the patent actually describes how you did it. So
Right.
the first thing you do is you have an invention and you have military applications, and you just keep it secret. So the military pays you, they buy your stuff, you install it in military applications, and then finally, when it gets to a point where they're ready to release it to the civilian sector, then they file the patent, because that lets the rabbit out of the hat. And that happened in December of 2006. So, but the military application of that was way long before that. It's uninterruptible autopilot. And when Dick Algeier was describing it in perfect detail, he had never heard of such a thing. So that was a lot of fun to actually sort of see things like that, because that made sense. If this actually was an inside job, if they were doing it for a reason, and we should go into the motivation, if they were doing this for a reason, then you'd have to say, um, you know, if this actually was an inside job, why would they trust, given the enormity of the preparations that were involved in it, why would they trust a bunch of idiotic Islamic terrorist pilots to fly those planes accurately? I mean, you wouldn't do it. I mean, you would want the pilot, you'd want the Islamic terrorists to be on the plane so you could blame it on them, but you're not going to trust them to actually fly the things correctly. I mean, they mostly flew
Exactly.
simulators. I mean, it was ridiculous. They were just idiots. Now, I'm a pilot, and when I was learning how to fly, I had, equivalent amount of flying hours as those guys had. So when I was learning how to fly, you have no idea how many times I would end up heading my plane towards the wrong runway. I would just point it in the wrong place. I mean, for example, I was flying out of an airport that had two parallel runways, and I'd be coming into one of the runways on the left. That means there are two parallel runways. I'm supposed to be on the left, and you fly parallel to the runway when you're flying in the pattern, and then you make a sharp turn, two turns, a U-turn, and then you're headed and you go right into the runway on the left. I can't tell you the number of times I overshot the runway and ended up heading directly into the runway on the right. Now, if there had been another plane there landing on the right runway while I was supposed to be landing on the left runway, I would have hit it and we would have been a mid-air collapse. And in fact, the control tower says if that does happen, by the way, there is another plane landing on the runway to the right. Make sure you make that turn correctly. So but I can't tell you the number of times I've actually made that turn and I said, "Holy Moses, where am I?" And then I looked and I'm on the wrong blankety blank runway, and I quickly slip over to the runway on the left. Now that's what new pilots do. And I'm not talking like new just a couple hours. Pilots that have a considerable amount of time, they often have that problem because when you make the turns, the wings actually block out a lot. You don't actually always see everything. I mean, you're making the turns, you're not always seeing you can't just sort of look out the window because the plane itself, the windows aren't giving you a panoramic view of everything. When you're making a turn, you're basically, the windows are sort of useless. You have to really rely on the instruments, then gut feelings and things like that. And newbies rely on all the wrong stuff. So the people who orchestrated this would have known all of that. So there's no way in the world they would have actually relied on those Islamic idiots to fly those planes correctly. I mean, so I mean, that's just point of fact. Now, the reality is those planes were flown perfectly. I mean, I saw the video coverage of the planes hitting the Twin Towers. They didn't miss a beat. And there were some aerobatics. There was some acrobatics aerobatics before they hit the plane, before they hit that. So they did
It was
some
spot on.
wild they had some wild turns in there, and then bang. Newbie pilots can't do wild turns and then go bang. I mean, you're talking Top Gun type stuff doing that. Now, when you're talking about the Pentagon, so we're sort of slipping over to the Pentagon, what that happened, that flying object was flying at near supersonic speeds, and it flew over wires and, the power wires and things like that, phone
Right.
wires, and trees at about 350 feet above ground that were on the edge of the Pentagon walls, on the edge of the Pentagon grounds. And then it dropped down immediately after it got over the trees and the wires. It dropped down immediately to 4 feet over the ground. This is in the backyard of the Pentagon.
Pretty
Leveled
incredible
out,
flying, isn't
yeah,
it?
leveled out, flew horizontally 4 feet over the ground, and smacked horizontally into the building. Now, the pilot groups, which I didn't study until after these remote viewing sessions came in, and I said, the remote viewing sessions clearly describe a missile. And so I said, a missile? I said, what are the pilot groups saying about this? So I went back and I investigated what the pilot groups were saying. And they said, look, we're pilots. A jumbo jet can't do that. I don't care if you have Tom Cruise and the Top Gun pilots in there, no matter who's doing it, a jumbo jet can't do that. It's like a lumbering albatross. It's like the Titanic. It it doesn't do that. You can't make it drop immediately over trees, a few hundred, couple hundred, 300 feet, level out immediately at 4 feet. I mean, it's sluggish. It goes like, and I'm telling you, I have flown the difference between, oh, let's go real small, between, say, a 152, Cessna 152, which is sort of a rinky-dink airplane, to one step above that, to a 172. And there's a huge difference between a slightly bigger aircraft, a 172, and a slightly smaller aircraft, a 152. So if you're talking now, and a 172 you can't handle like you can handle a 152, even though the person from the outside would say they look the same to me. But the 172 is heavier, it's sluggish, it's more sluggish. And so now we're talking about a jumbo jet, which is like nowhere comparison to a Cessna 152 or 72, 172. And so it cannot do that kind of things. And then let's say it could do that, which it can't do, but let's say it could do that. As a pilot, let me tell you, you would have to have way better than Tom Cruise and the Top Gun people flying that thing. Meaning, the pilot would have to be the best pilot in the universe, let alone the planet Earth. I mean, it would have to be if the plane could do it, which it cannot do. And so, but we don't have to worry about that because the remote viewing data clearly describe both Dick Allgaier and Daz Smith, and you see it yourself on video when they describe these things. They say they describe the launch of the vehicle of the missile, the cruise missile, the flight of the cruise missile. They describe the people who launched the cruise missile. They describe where it came from, and they describe
Where did
its
it come
flight.
from?
Well, Dick Allgaier describes it. There's a little bit of ambiguity here. Daz Smith seems to describe a cruise missile that may have a land launch, but he doesn't go into it in much detail. But he does describe a few people, a small group of people that are experts in that type of thing, totally reliable in terms of they were assigned to do this thing and so on. And Dick Allgaier goes into that in much greater depth. He describes the people the same way that Daz does, but unlike Daz, he describes the environment around them much more. And he describes it as a missile coming out of a submarine. So it was a submarine launched missile, and he describes it exactly coming up, being shot out of the submarine. It ignites above the air, I mean, above the water, shoots off, and flies, and he describes where it is, off of Washington. I mean, the whole thing. He describes it in clear detail, and similarly with Daz. But the quality of Daz Smith sessions and Dick Allgaier sessions are equal in every respect. However, sometimes one viewer will focus in on one part more than the other, and sometimes. So with Dick, he focused a little bit more on the actual people and vehicles that the missile was launched from, whereas Dick Allgaier, I'm sorry, Daz Smith was focusing more on the organization of the people, the groups of people that were doing all this. And Daz Smith, really described in detail the different groups that were involved, which group handled which things, which group was doing operations on the ground, which group was controlling things, which group was dealing with the things in the air, and then the top tier people who were very mysterious, but they were ones who were organizing the entire thing.
Can you
And
get
we
into
even,
that with us?
well, everything is there. It's way too much detail to cover here, but it's in the documentaries, all the detail. In fact, you have a clear session from Dick Allgaier where he goes into the meetings where all the preparations are being done and documents are being forged. All
Now,
types of
is
things
there
are
any
being forged.
foreign interest in this? Sorry to interrupt. Are there any foreign interests in this, or is this all, inside job stuff?
It's all inside job stuff, but there may have been. We don't have any unambiguous evidence suggesting foreign stuff. However, and what I mean by that unambiguous is that we don't have something from both viewers that are corroborated. There was something from a foreign interest that was described by one of the viewers, but it was so controversial we snipped that out of the documentary because the other viewer did not corroborate it. So,
Could you share it with us here?
no, but that will probably come out um, at sometime in 2015 when Dick Allgaier will be releasing all of his original raw sessions, and eventually we'll be releasing all of the raw sessions for Daz Smith. Now, mind you, we have 4 hours of stuff. So that's most of everything. I mean, that's like 80% of everything. But some people want to see absolutely every single minute. And, but some parts would have been drawn, potentially inaccurate conclusions would have been drawn from them and they weren't corroborated. So what we wanted the project to be is we wanted to say, this is the stuff you can take to the bank. This is the stuff we found, and it's more than enough for anybody. And there's a couple details that people would like to focus on, but if it wasn't corroborated by both viewers, we're not going to say, go to the bank on it. But I can say this much, and this will be true no matter what. If there was any foreign involvement, if there was any foreign involvement, it would have been done under great duress, meaning this was an inside job, according to these remote viewing data from both Daz Smith and Dick Allgaier, orchestrated from within the U.S., and that the foreign elements, if there were any, would have been pressed into service with a lot of pressure, meaning there would have been nobody jumping at the gun saying, yeah, let's do that, let's get involved with that. It would have been something that somebody in the officialdom in the U.S. was twisting their arms mightily in order to do it. So from that perspective, you can say, yes, it was a completely inside job. And if any foreign operatives were involved, they would have been pressed into service, with huge amounts of pressure. Because you can imagine what would have happened if somebody assisted with this and it ever became public. I mean, that would have been the worst public relations disaster in the history of anything. And so nobody would have done this willingly, easily. I mean, a lot of arm twisting would have had to have gone on. So if there was any foreign involvement, you can still say this was an inside job orchestrated from within the United States. If they used some bit players outside of the United States, it was not because the foreign people wanted to do it or got involved in it by themselves voluntarily. I mean, it was a lot of pressure would have had to have gone on to do this. But anyway, but those types of things might come out. I do not want anyone to think that any big stuff is withheld from this documentary. All the big stuff is there. Every little piece is there. This is the stuff that was corroborated by both viewers, and the amount of stuff that's in the documentaries is overwhelming when you see it. It's just like, I mean, no news story has ever had this much detail in it. It's and people that focus on Building 7 or people that focus on the Pentagon, never have you seen such a comprehensive description of every aspect of the entire orchestrated events, from the details of what happened on the ground to who was actually doing. We even have pictures, sketches, good sketches, actually not pictures, they're not sketches, but they're color sketches of the top guy at the top who was in charge of the whole damn thing. So, and I'm not going to mention any names, but we have good pictures of the whole thing. And we have good schematic diagrams. Daz Smith is a graphics artist and drew up a beautiful, very clear schematic diagram of exactly what the different groups were and what they were actually doing. And that's in the documentaries as well. So anyway, that was that. Now, with regard to the Pentagon stuff, remember I described targets A, B, and C. Targets D was the one that started the Pentagon. And and again, it's on our website, farsight.org. That was the target that target was the initial airborne launch or takeoff of whatever object caused the damage shown to the Pentagon building. Now, that was the first target dealing with the Pentagon. And so before they got any explosive stuff hitting the Pentagon, I wanted them to see, what was the takeoff like? Now, if it was a jet taking off from an aircraft, taking off from an airport, that would have done it for me. Okay, here was a jet. So that's what I wanted to see. Was it a jet or whatever? But both Daz Smith and Dick Algard describe a missile launch. And I said, whoa, there was no jet there. There was a missile launch coming out. Not only, and then if you look at some of the anomalistic evidence on the ground, well, the hole in the Pentagon building is too small for a jet. It's the right size for a cruise missile. Whatever did hit the Pentagon had no wings. There are no wings in the wreckage, and there's no marks on the sides of the Pentagon where the wings should have been. So whatever did happen in the Pentagon didn't have wings. And so there is some physical evidence of, aircraft in the wreckage, but you never know what happened, how that evidence got there, whether it was planted or whether it's the right evidence, meaning the cruise missile could have had some parts put onto it, and also some pieces could have been put there. I mean, you never know. The thing is so complicated. Whoever orchestrated this was trying to cover all types of tracks. So you can't believe anything that was sort of officially shown. But what we do show is that whatever did hit the Pentagon could not have flown like that if it was a jumbo jet. And B, the hole that was in there that was made in the Pentagon is too small for a jumbo jet. And C, whatever hit it didn't have wings. There are no wings in the wreckage. And there's no marks on the sides of the Pentagon where there should have been wings. So, our remote viewing data match what we see on the ground more than the official conspiracy theory, which is the official governmental story of what happened. And then target E, which was the next target, was the cause of the damage to the Pentagon building. So we actually wanted to see what was the cause, what actually crashed into it. And then again, we got a missile crashing into it. But, that's just sort of a thumbnail. The full description of the missile hitting it is like unbelievable. Anyway, target F was, I wanted to say, well, what about this American Airlines Flight 77? That was the thing that was supposed to have hit the Pentagon. So I said, where is it? So we were actually looking for American Airlines Flight 77, but I wanted to find it on September 12th, the day after. So I wanted to know, where is the flight, and is it in a pile of wreckage, or did it land someplace? And Rex, that is a mystery we have not solved. I do not know where American Airlines Flight 77 was. As far as these data are concerned, American Airlines Flight 77 was the cruise missile. Now, I do not know how to explain that, but when you target American Airlines Flight 77, we get that cruise missile. Now, I don't know how to explain that. I simply do not know how to explain that. The numbers could have been switched. Another number could have been put on there. Maybe American Airlines Flight 77 was there was a strange 45-minute delay on the tarmac at the airport when such a plane was supposedly taking off. Maybe there was a switch. Maybe I don't know what happened to it. I don't have the foggiest idea. But there's also other crazy things. There are cameras all over the airport, Washington Dulles Airport. I mean, there's cameras all over the place, and there is no video footage of Islamic terrorists getting on that plane. So I mean, there's all types of crazy things that don't match up. But when we tried to find American Airlines Flight 77, the only thing we find is a cruise missile hitting the air. We don't find like actual aircrafts that had people in it. I have no remote viewing data whatsoever showing a large aircraft with people in it hitting the Pentagon. So I don't know what happened to that flight. And maybe we could have spent more time on this whole project to try to unravel that mystery. We could have found American Airlines Flight 77 at the airport and then followed it and then number changed. That would have been a whole new project. But at this point, there's only so much you can ask these viewers to do, and this is a big project, and so I just had to let that one go. So anyway,
Well,
then the final one was the final target G was any preparations that would have caused the collapse of the North Tower, the Twin Towers. So at that, and the World Trade Center. So at that point, I wanted to go back to New York for the last target and say any preparations. Now, if the preparations were Islamic idiots taking flight lessons to prepare for a bombing, then that would have been the preparations. But what we got was not Islamic idiots taking flight lessons. What we got was incredibly detailed preparations with corporate governmental people at the top orchestrating everything, forging documents, making sure everything worked out where they had backup plans upon backup plans upon backup plans in case any little thing went wrong. All that detail is explicitly put out in the documentaries. By the way, Rex, can I interject a question that I think would be appropriate for you to ask?
absolutely.
If this is all true, why are we having this interview? Meaning, why were we not stopped? I guarantee you. I mean, we've had the military guys on our board of directors, for heaven's sakes. Why the military watches us? I guarantee you, everything there. We have no secrets. We don't encrypt any mail. We don't encrypt any telephone conversations. We don't try to hide. It was very clear from the very beginning, going back to the late 1990s, that if we were going to operate, we had to do so with complete transparency, meaning that the government had to have complete, we don't have to worry about giving them anything. They can get into any computer system at all.
Well,
So
I
you
would
can,
say I would say the reason is because there's so much information out there now, like, for example, Richard Gage and the architects for 911 Truth. There's been information out there for years about inside job possibilities.
okay,
That
now
there
Rex,
might,
let me flip this question back on you this way. Why is Richard Gage and architects and engineers the way they are? Why are they able to do it? You see, if you go, I've dealt with these intel people before, these agency people before. I'm talking personal communications. They have been ordered to and successfully done disrupting of, say, UFO groups going back to the early 1950s. I mean, literally,
absolutely.
a very typical technique would be for them to send people to the meetings of these UFO groups, and then to cause internal fighting, meaning somebody would become a trusted member, and then you know stories would be told, backstabbing would occur, internal fights, and eventually the groups just start fragmenting. And this has been very successful at breaking up these groups nonstop until all the way up to the current time period. So they're really good at breaking up groups when they want to break up groups. Trust me, they're really good at breaking up groups. That they don't have to kill people. They don't have to do it. They can just dismantle the groups piece by piece by causing so much internal infrastructure. And the groups don't ever know the difference. They thought there was that the people in their organization were normal people. They didn't know that they were under the pay of the intel groups and that they were being disruptive on purpose.
They
So
obviously
anyway,
want us to know. They
yeah.
want the
So
population
the
to
so
know.
the point is the reason. Look at the 9/11 people. The pilot groups, there's like 1,500 people. There's like, well over 1,000 pilots that have signed on to this thing. Big pilots, airline pilots, and everything. Architects and engineers group, they got over 3,000 people. Authorities, architects, engineers of all, going all the way up. I mean, they have a documentary hosted by Ed Asner, the famous actor, former president of Screen Actors Guild, the job once held by Ronald Reagan. That's 15-minute documentary you can see on YouTube. I mean, they've got there are two-star generals, for God's sake, that have come out and sort of talked all about this. So why aren't the Intel people breaking up all of this? They have the capability to break up all of this, but all the groups are not being interfered with. Nobody's being interfered with. Richard Gage's group is not being interfered with. Farsight stuff is not being interfered with. So you have to say, if they're so good at breaking up these groups, why is nobody breaking us up? They could have squashed us like a bug. They could have stopped this thing, just as soon as we started it, and there would have been no documentaries on it. Why is it happening? There can be only one conclusion, Rex. The government is split.
Agenda?
The government has to be split, meaning there must be a huge, probably majority of the Intel people that are royally ticked that this took place, and we're being protected. That's the only possible solution. There is nothing else that makes sense. Richard Gage may not know that he's being protected, but the only way the architects and engineers group can be as big as it is, and as loud as it is, and as well organized and well financed as it is it's got to be working under protection. Not protection that it asked for, but protection that it has. Meaning there must be a huge element within the government that's royally ticked that this happened. Now, if you go back in time, this idea of having a major event in order to cause an invasion that was desired for some reason is not at all new. I mean, heck, if you go back far enough, you have Bismarck conspiring to get Napoleon III. Now, that's not Napoleon Bonaparte, but his nephew, who was running France some years after Napoleon Bonaparte, invade all the German principalities. Basically, what happened was, this is back in the 1800s, the guy running Prussia, Wilhelm I, was trying to make one of his relatives the king of Spain, and on the suggestion of Bismarck. And Napoleon heard about it, got royally ticked, and sent the ambassador to Wilhelm I, and said, "If you dare do this again, your ass is grass." I mean, it's like, this is not going to happen. You're not going to surround us with somebody in Spain and in Germany so you leave Spain alone or the end. And Wilhelm I was very amenable. He said, "Oh, sorry about it. Look, we didn't mean to upset you. Everything's fine. Trust me, we won't try that again." So the Napoleon's ambassador to Prussia, wrote up a telegram called the Elm Telegram, ELM, saying, "Don't worry, Wilhelm has agreed not to do this again. He apologized. The whole thing's over. Everything's good." Bismarck intercepted the telegram and rewrote it, essentially giving Napoleon the bird, like, blank you. We're going to do whatever we blankety blank want. And Napoleon popped the cork. He said, "What? Are you serious?" When he got the telegram, and he ordered an invasion. Now, at the time, they were all German principalities. Think of states like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, but they weren't grouped into one country. And Bismarck wanted to group them into one country so that there would be a Germany. And he wanted the invasion to happen so that all the German principalities would do that. Well, then Napoleon goes invading them, and all the Germans said, "What? We were uninvaded, and we were invaded, and we didn't do anything. We didn't do anything to upset. Why are we being invaded?" So they were outraged, and never bet against a group of people who feel aggrieved. So they felt aggrieved, and they bounded together, and they had a congressional congress. They molded together into a nation, and they beat Napoleon. They beat him back, and in 1871, they captured Paris. And Bismarck said, "Good job. It worked perfectly." And so that's how Germany came about. So you see, he actually wanted an invasion. Now, if you go later, for example, World War II, it is well known. Actually, it's not well known, but it is undisputed among people who know what they're talking about, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew there would be an incident in the Pacific and was waiting for it. Now, when Churchill was meeting with Roosevelt on a destroyer in the North Atlantic, he was begging Roosevelt. He said, "Look, we're being hit by bombs all the time. The Germans are bombing London. I mean, it's terrible. You have to come in now." And Roosevelt said, "We are not going to enter the European conflict until I have a united country behind me. I'm not going to enter it like Woodrow Wilson entered World War One." And with Woodrow Wilson, he was fighting a battle home with domestic critics as well as on the European continent. And Roosevelt said, "I'm not going to do that." And there were many opponents, isolationist components, that did not want to enter the war in Europe, including Joseph Kennedy, the former ambassador to Britain. He is the father of John Kennedy, Robert Ted Kennedy, so on. And, he was absolutely opposed to entering the war to fight European battles. And so Roosevelt made the agreement with Churchill that he would transform the U.S. economy into a wartime economy, so that instead of making cars and spoons and things like that, he'd make tanks and bullets. And he'd ship that all over to Britain so that it could fight its own war, but without any American personnel. And that's what Roosevelt constantly said in all of his public addresses. But he knew that there was going to be an incident in the Pacific. He told Churchill that there was going to be an incident in the Pacific, and as soon as the incident happened, he would have no opposition in the country, and he'd put American troops there. And like how do I know this? Well, you can see it for yourself. For example, Turner Catledge, who was the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, a very close associate of Roosevelt, knew this personally, told us. And Turner Catledge, you can see him on video on YouTube. I think it's Leaders of the 20th Century, Roosevelt, Hail to the Chief, or Manipulator-in-Chief. The videos are on YouTube. You can actually see them. And you actually see Turner Catledge actually describing what Roosevelt had told him. So this isn't some obscure person. This is the editor-in-chief of the New York Times describing exactly what Roosevelt told him, that they were waiting for this. Now, there were other people that knew as well, such as the ambassador to Australia and so on, that have talked about it, but the Australian ambassador, rather. But the issue is that among people who know what they're talking about, they knew that Roosevelt was waiting for that incident in the Pacific. Now, that doesn't mean he knew the exact details of the Pearl Harbor attack, although he might have. The point is that he knew something like that was going to happen, and he wanted it to happen, and he was engineering it to happen. He actually wanted something big like that to happen. And when it did happen, all opposition went away. He entered the war against not only Japan, but also against the European continent, against the fascists. And, and his navy in the Pacific was resurrected in a few months. And off they were, fighting away. In fact, some curious things happened with regard to the Navy in the Pacific. There were 2 destroyers. They were the most modern in the fleet. They mysteriously disappeared from Pearl Harbor 2 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. and they were the only things left of the Navy. And
Right.
after Pearl Harbor, they did what's called a cat and mouse game, meaning they steamed all over the Pacific, letting themselves be seen by the Japanese Navy. And then they quickly turned and ran and went somewhere else and be seen. So the Japanese were saying, "I thought we got all these boats, but now we're seeing them all over the place. There must be a whole American Navy out there." So that was making the Japanese much more cautious. But the American 2 destroyers were told, "Do not engage under any circumstances," for a couple months. 2 months later, 3 months later, the Navy was rebuilt. They had brand new ships out there and everything. And then they were allowed to engage. So, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but the direct evidence, as you can see for yourself with Turner Catledge talking about it, it was very clear. Roosevelt knew it was going to happen. So if you go to the Vietnam War, for example, we have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. There was a 2-day event where the first day in the Gulf of Tonkin, some North Vietnamese torpedo boats tried to approach and fire on the USS Maddox, which is a destroyer. Now, they caused essentially no damage to the Maddox, or absolutely very minimal scratchings to the Maddox. But, it was reported back in Washington that there was a vicious North Vietnamese, did I say Korean? I meant North Vietnamese attack on U.S. boats, and we needed to be able to defend ourselves. And then 2 days later, there was reported another major attack by North Vietnamese boats on the USS Maddox again. Well, what was not told to Congress was that the first attack caused no damage, or almost no damage, and the second attack did not happen at all. Zero, zip. It didn't happen. Now, what is what is not in dispute? That is what I just told you. What is in dispute is whether President Johnson and his Secretary of State, especially President Johnson, whether he knew he was lying to Congress when he told Congress about the two attacks and he needed authority to defend American forces, and they passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So we don't know if he knew he was lying or not, but there's some evidence that suggests that he could have been very aware that the second incident didn't happen. A lot of questions are raised. Anyway, he went right to Congress and said, "We have been attacked twice. Bloody murder. This is terrible. We had to defend ourselves." And the Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And then the full blown American escalation of the Vietnam War happened. And then, of course, we have 9/11, which is the same type of thing, an event. So if you want, and by the way, and Johnson definitely did want at the time to increase American intervention into Vietnam. He wanted the war. He wanted the Vietnam War to be fought. He thought we could win it, and he thought there were good reasons to it. So with 9/11, you can assume that there were people that actually thought the war was important, that we had to have a war, an Iraqi war. So and they knew that the American public was not going to tolerate another war in Iraq without good reason. So they knew that something had to happen to trigger that to occur. And so the Twin Towers turned out to be what actually happened, and the Pentagon building. Now the Pentagon building is particularly interesting because that throws off the scent. Even if there's great anomalies with the World Trade Center stuff, which there were, the Pentagon could always say, the military people could always say, well, don't look at us. We got bombed too. so, so the Pentagon bombing is the
Right.
perfect cover. I mean, it's the perfect cover. And now, to add to all this, even though the fact that there's lots of sloppiness, what was being dependent on the most? What was being dependent on the most is that the American public and the press would follow dutifully whatever they're said, meaning whatever you tell them, they will believe. So that's, like when you're doing refinishing of a house, you're doing renovations, and there's lots of nails in the wall and holes and all evidence that there's been a lot of construction inside. Well, they bring out spackling powder and they fill in all the gaps and stuff like that. So all the things that got broke while the renovations were going on, they get covered up. Well, they knew that the media and the public would act like spackling powder. They knew that the media and the government and the people, the public, would allow them to cover up all the types of mess that actually happened. So that's why people like Richard Gage and the A&E people, as well as the far side remote viewing stuff, that's why that's not been known by the whole planet. It's because the press won't report it. They only report the official story, and the press is actually dumbed down now to only report hyperbolic fear, adrenaline stuff. Basically, they've got the entire planet addicted to adrenaline rushes associated with fear.
Right.
Yeah, they feed that stuff into it, the people react, and then it goes on from one fear adrenaline injection to the next. And so, getting people to calm down and sort of realize all this stuff is very difficult. However, I can say that it's very important that the 9/11 project was done. And this is the following reason. Even if 7 billion people haven't heard about our results, even if most of the people on the planet haven't heard about remote viewing, the major governments on the planet know about remote viewing. They know that the Farsight Institute is the premier venue for public remote viewing studies. They know that what we do is squeaky clean and absolutely top of the line. And so they follow us. So now, even if the masses haven't picked up what we've done, every major government in the world now knows about it. Meaning, all the cat's out of the bag. And a huge, must be majority element within the intel community within the United States wanted it to happen. Trust me, it could not have happened unless they wanted it to happen. So the intel community is not authorized to come out and say, look, this is what really happened. They can't fess up. They can't tell what happened. They're not, the government's not going to allow them to do that. But on the other hand, they can stop people from doing it, or they can allow people from doing it. They've opted to allow it to happen. So that's how come I'm on your show. That's how come we're talking right now. We've been allowed to talk about it. So and there's absolutely no way in the world that you could come to any other conclusion than that. There's no way that we could be allowed to talk about this, or that Richard Gage would be allowed to talk about the architects and engineers stuff, if somebody in Washington didn't want it to come out some way. So, you know, we're not doing something that's that's being opposed nonstop. We're not able to do that if the government really wanted us to be quiet, you'd never even hear my name.
Well, exactly, and I'm glad you brought that up because, you also mentioned the brain drain media. Several corporations control over 90% of what people see and hear on the news and on the radio. So you're only going to hear what they want you to. For example, this Ebola scare that's going
Oh,
on right now, I
let's
feel that
talk about Ebola just for a second, so we
yeah,
can
why don't we do that?
so that we can use that as an example for what we're talking about. Ebola is like AIDS in the sense that it's a virus that's very difficult to transmit. It's not like the flu, it's not like the measles, it's not airborne. You actually have to be in direct contact with the bodily fluids and put those bodily fluids inside your body. Like you have to actually touch somebody with Ebola, get some of the juices on you, and then blow your nose and put your finger in your nose or something. You actually have to
It
go
depends
through.
on which strand, though. There's actually several cases where there's been transmission via aerosol. So maybe
Well,
the
but
particular
in
strain
that
now.
case, the aerosol has to be sprayed, meaning the liquid has to actually be puffed into the air to get into you. The point is, it's not like the measles and the flu. So if you look at what's happened so far with Ebola, is you have a few thousand people that died with it. Okay, it's too big. It was and mostly in Africa and a few people that got to the United States. But it's going to burn itself out. You're only talking a few thousand people. You're not talking 100,000 people. You're not talking a million people. If you're talking the flu, or you're talking the measles or chicken pox, well, okay, you're talking millions upon hundreds of millions. And so if you had something like that, Ebola would be a very serious thing. But just a few thousand people, I mean, like 5,000 people total. And so, really, what we're talking about is a level of hype, a level of fear porn that is unbelievable. Where they're pumping out, look, it's going to get you next. It's gonna punch on you. You have to be careful now. Start washing your hands. It's a joke. It's a joke. It's fear porn. It's the
It
adrenaline thing.
is.
Now, it's not saying that Ebola is not a serious disease. It is a serious disease. It's not saying that it couldn't get out of control. It could, but it's very, very unlikely that that
It reminds me of the 2009 swine flu fake pandemic that the CDC tried to push down everybody's throats so that they
you
could
know.
sell vaccines.
Look at AIDS. AIDS spread so widely. It's like Ebola in the sense that it's difficult to spread unless bodily fluids are exchanged. AIDS spread because there was a huge delay in um, in the time when it actually started to compromise the immune system. So very often people get like a really bad flu, sort of like getting mononucleosis, like after 6 weeks. And they just thought they really got it, but they bounced back. But they thought they had a really bad flu, and that's it. So it's like years later before they actually realize that other things are starting to happen to them, cancers and other things. So you have this long period where they're infectious and don't know about it, and they're having sex with other people. So in certain communities where there's a lot of multiple partner type stuff without safe sex, without contacts, without condoms, well, the virus spread like wildfire. Well, Ebola doesn't have years. It has from a few days to a few weeks of an incubation period. So there is a bit of a risk, but it's not it's not the type of risk you can have with AIDS with regard to exchange of bodily fluids because it's not that long before someone's actually sick. So it can be spread, but it can also be put out. So you can expect that the Ebola thing will burn itself out, just as it has burned itself out many times before. This is not the first time. This Ebola outbreak in West Africa has been around since March. If this was the flu, or if this was measles or the chickenpox, I mean, we're talking since March. It would have been we would have it would have had like over a billion. I don't know how many, but it would have been hundreds of millions and perhaps a few billion people would have been infected by it by now. So it's not that kind of a virus. So the major point that I'm trying to emphasize now is that the hype, the fear porn, is way out of proportion to the actual risk on the ground of you or me or anybody that you know or I know actually getting it. There is a risk for people who actually work with Ebola patients. So if you happen to be a doctor and Doctors Without Borders, for example, and you're working with Ebola patients and you're actually touching them, sticking thermometers into their mouth and things like that, if you don't have specialized protective gear, after a long period of time, there's a chance you might get it. Sort of like leprosy. If you're around leprosy patients for a long time, well, eventually you might sort of catch it. So there's a problem with people who are in direct contact. But I'm going to say something now that sounds calloused with regard to Ebola, but it's true. Societies have to learn, and sometimes the only way societies can learn is to go through things like this. For example, in West Africa, there is traditions where when people die, people in the burial services go up and they touch the bodies. They go up and they actually, literally caress the bodies as part of the funerary services. And that, of course, gets them infected. So, one of the things that has to be learned in societies is don't touch a dead body. Once somebody's died, and especially if it's Ebola, test it to find out and then burn the thing. Don't bury it, don't let anybody touch it, isolate it. And there is no way to teach that without having these events happen. People have to realize, hey, they just can't do things the way they used to do it. They have to do it differently now. And so these are traditions that have gone back since the beginning of time that have to change. For example, I mean, there's habits like such as female circumcision that still happens in parts of Africa that is horrific. People have to learn that you can't do that anymore. That's not something that's okay. That you can't cut off the genitals of a female anymore. But trying to get people to actually change their behavior is one thing. You can write a law against female circumcision, but getting people out in the bush to actually stop doing that, believe me, it's a uphill struggle. So when you get things like this happening in West Africa, well, okay, but that's where it's going to happen. You don't have people touching dead bodies in the United States. You have it happening in West Africa. So if there's going to be an outbreak of a few thousand people, it's going to happen in West Africa. It's not going to happen in the United States. But you don't hear that happening on the news. You hear the news saying, "Oh my gosh, there is a person in Texas who has Ebola. Everybody run for cover. Wash your finger, wash your hands." I mean, it's it's fear
Well,
porn.
and not only that, with the internet now, and as easy it is for anybody to write anything, then you're going to have 50 different posts come up that say, now you've got Ebola death camps and you've got these Black Hawk helicopters picking people up at hospitals and taking them to FEMA camps and making
You
them
get all
disappear.
types of stuff spreading through the
Exactly.
internet
Exactly.
that's as wacky as could be, and there's no control over all of that. And it's absolutely true. All this stuff happens. So it's not just that the major media is feeding the fear porn, but you have sort of side addicts, street addicts of fear porn contributing to it as well by coming up with these fake stories about it and sort of adding to it because they like the thrill too of people believing their lies that that they start
Right.
talking about the
And they're
black
feeding into the
helicopters are
system
coming.
just as bad.
Yeah, they're feeding into the system. So again, I'm not minimizing the direness of the Ebola virus when it's caught by a group of people. I mean, it is a deadly virus. And when you're dealing with it, you need to have protective clothing and well trained people and so on like that. But you're not talking about a worldwide pandemic of millions and millions of people like we do with the flu and the and measles and chickenpox and things like that. And that's not coming across the media. The media is doing just the opposite. They're hyping up, oh no, another person has been discovered. Run for cover. This is the end of the world. And that's the typical fear porn. So, calmly talking about things is not the way of life today. And so, when we're talking about this 9/11 project, we're talking about looking at the data and then calmly evaluating everything that's there. And that's not normal for today's audience. In fact, I bet we'd have more people looking at our stuff if we were talking about the evilness of the Islamic terrorists who insidiously, you know, flew those planes and trained till they were perfect pilots to be able to do all of that stuff, and sort of saying, look for an Islamic terrorist right around the corner from where you live because that person may be doing the same thing. It may be your house next, World Trade Center yesterday, and now your house next today. I mean, if we started to say stuff like that, more people might be listening to it because they would feed into their fear porn addiction. But the reality is, you need to have a settled mind, and you have to calmly look at all the data, the anomalistic data that's put out by people like Richard Gage and A&E, Architects and Engineers Group, and then looking at the remote viewing data. And then you have to understand remote viewing to understand how we could have gotten that. And that's why the video documentaries are so important, because you see it. You don't have to have it explained to you. You can actually see it live right in front of you. And you say, and the response by everyone that I've talked to is that they finally understood how remote viewing works and why it's difficult to do, why there are only a few people who are really good enough to do it, sort of world class at that level as Dick Algar and Daz Smith. And then they also realize how complicated the actual 9/11 story is. They start to realize that not only is remote viewing real, but the anomalistic evidence is really pointing in one direction, and the remote viewing data pointing in the exact same direction. And then they hopefully will get information like from what you and I are talking about, which is the only reason we're telling them this is because somebody in the government wants them to hear it, because otherwise we wouldn't be allowed to do it.
Well, and could you tell us? Obviously, there's usually multiple reasons why giant events like 9/11 happen. The
Yeah,
research
it,
that's
it
been
turns out to be
done.
it's pretty easy to sort of figure out why. Now, the people who did it, now this is going to hit you wrong, but it's just brace yourself for it. The people who did it, I believe, are honestly very patriotic people. I believe that they actually thought they were doing the right thing. I believe they actually thought they needed a Pearl Harbor event, that Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. He should have been taken out during the first Gulf War, the Desert Storm War, the first one, under George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush. And they thought that was a big mistake to not take Saddam Hussein out, and that Saddam Hussein was intolerably controlling too much of the world's oil supplies, and that we were entering into a time period where the oil supplies were in greater scarcity, and it simply could not be tolerated that you could have somebody like Saddam Hussein sitting for no good reason whatsoever on such a large pile of oil. And I'm sure that that argument was extremely convincing to them. In addition, I'm sure that they said that there were probably reasons why the World Trade Center had to come down. For example, in 1993, I believe it was February, there was a bombing underneath the World Trade Center. Actually, it was in a parking lot indirectly. But the point is, it blew out a hole in 5 floors of the World Trade Center. There was a structural integrity issue with the North Tower. And the building itself may have been compromised to the point where it was going to have to come down anyway. Also, all of the buildings, Building 7, and the North and the South Towers, were filled with asbestos. Now, when you build a big building like that, it's not designed to be taken down. And the renovation of a building like that is a very expensive deal. And taking down the World Trade Center is not something that you really want to do with a crane, where you knock out each brick one at a time. Is the only way to do it is with demolition. And if you're going to do demolition for the World Trade Center, such a big building, you're going to wreck the entire downtown New York. So the collateral damage would be huge. So A, the buildings at some point probably needed to come down anyway. There was going to be lawsuits all over the place with regard to the asbestos issue. I'm not saying it couldn't have been dealt with if that was the only issue. What I am saying is that if people wanted a 9/11 event, the World Trade Centers sort of stood out as likely candidates. They could have come up with a rationale for wanting to do it rather than to have them renovated or taken down. Now, the owners of the World Trade Center would have had to pay for the renovation or taking down the buildings. But what's more important, that when the 9/11 things happened, that all that got done for free, meaning the buildings were taken down for free and the insurance companies paid for the building.
Well, didn't
So,
they take out giant insurance policies just weeks before the event?
well, yeah, before the event, I'm not sure it was weeks, but not long before the event, insurance policies were taken out, and it was that's sort of another whole bunch of stuff. I mean, the ownership shifted before the event, and insurance policies are taken out. That's what I've heard. I mean, I'm not an expert on that. You're telling me, but I've heard the same thing. I think I've even read it on Wikipedia. So I mean, it's not apparently something that's hard to find out.
Right.
But again, I'm not an authority on that stuff. But yeah, there was ownership changes as well as insurance policy things. But what is clear is that the insurance companies paid for everything, so it was free. Whereas otherwise, the owners would have had to pay through their nose to have everything sort of fixed up. Now, it's not saying that the World Trade Center couldn't have been renovated or it couldn't have been structurally reinforced. It's not saying that that couldn't have happened. It's just that it seemed like a nice candidate to why go there? Why not just take it down? We needed a big event anyway, and that was something that would be really nationally watched, internationally watched. And so, sort of, why go the renovation route and pay for all that when, in fact, we can just have it done this way and we get our war? So I think that's the basic bottom line motivation. They wanted a war against Iraq. They wanted to recontrol the oil supplies for what they thought was patriotic things, reasons that had to have been done. They were probably upset that it wasn't done originally with the first Gulf War, and they knew of no other way. And if you look at the history of major wars, major battles where we were successful, they always have an initiating event, whether it's Pearl Harbor or going back to Bismarck, Napoleon attacking in what looks like an unprovoked attack. Um,
Right.
you get some type of event that makes the nation absolutely terrified. I mean, actually not terrified, but absolutely aggrieved, angry beyond belief, and never bet against a nation that feels that way. You know, after World War II, I mean, after Pearl Harbor, there was no way the U.S. was going to lose that war. It was like, we were going to do it. Now, Roosevelt knew we had to enter World War II. The Nazis would have had the atomic bomb within short order. I mean, he knew that if he didn't stop the Nazis, we were going to be conquered. And there was no ambiguity about that. He knew we had to fight the Nazis. He also knew that the Nazis were the big threat. Japan could have been dealt with. The Nazis were the biggies. They had to be stopped. So the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor actually led to a war that was different from just an attack on the Japanese, just fighting the Japanese. It led to a war in Europe. Now that was very similar to what happened with 9/11. You get an attack by Al Qaeda, a seeming attack by Al Qaeda, and then a necessary response by attacking Afghanistan. But the real war they wanted to fight was in Iraq. Well, with World War II, you get an attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, initiating a necessary declaration of war against the Japanese. But the real war they wanted to fight was in Europe. And so the next day or 2 days later, whatever it was, they declared war on Germany. And nobody was asking questions at that point. So, that's how it works. Once you get everybody upset enough, you just start fighting and there will be no questions. You knock out all the opposition. And then you also got the Patriot Act, where all types of, uh, you know, freedoms were compromised, and that in ways that simply could not have happened prior to that. So, you get all types of sort of changes that occur that they otherwise could not have got done. So, and I'm sure that these people that were doing it actually thought that all this was necessary. Just like during the Vietnam War, you had a lot of things happen that were unethical, illegal, but the people doing it thought they were doing it for the better. I mean, they didn't think that they were actually acting in a traitorous manner. They thought they were doing something that was the right thing to do, and that the American people just didn't know any better, so that they had to force the American people to do what was right for them. I'm sure that that's what the people at the top thought. It's only afterwards that they realized that they were not correct. They were idiots. They shouldn't have done it, the whole thing. So, what must be going on right now is there must be a huge section of the government and the military that knows everything and is royally ticked because Al Qaeda and even Iraq, they're not the same as the Nazis, meaning Roosevelt knew correctly that the Nazis had to be defeated. There was no question. We needed absolutely to enter World War II. But you cannot say that about Al Qaeda. We had, ever since 1993, we had gotten the computer system that the Al Qaeda people use. We knew all the people that were involved in the Al Qaeda movement. We were tracking everybody. It was easy to stamp them out. It was easy to go after them. They were not the Nazis. They may have been a mean and nasty group, but they could be controlled. What was really necessary is that we fight this big battle in Iraq, and so you use those people to do it, to do the necessary thing. So the great ironies of the whole thing is if these remote viewing data are correct, and I think they are correct because I was one who orchestrated the collection of the data, and I know the quality of these viewers. And these viewers have enormous public track records and experiments at the Farsight Institute going back many, many, many years with many projects that we've had, often with public verification of the data collection process. I mean, we're an open book as far as that is concerned, squeaky clean in scientific studies. So when you actually look at what we do, it's very clear that these people are very believable, that their data are very believable. So from my point of view, it's clear that these events actually did occur the way the remote viewing events describe it. At least that's what I believe based on these data, because I know how the data were collected. But it's also clear that you're not looking at evil people at the top that are in a Machiavellian way trying to just steal and do evil things. They probably were acting in as patriotic a way as anyone would act in thinking of patriotism, but they had very misguided notions. And they probably thought that the public was idiots and that had to be manipulated, controlled to do what's right. They had to take their medicine. And they thought they were doing that. And there must be a huge proportion of the government right now that realizes that that was idiotic thinking, that Al Qaeda was not the same as the Nazis, and there was no reason to have a Pearl Harbor type of event just to control them. And even Saddam Hussein with the oil, it wasn't the same as the threat that the Nazis posed. So anyway, that's what my sense is to explain the motivations for these 9/11 events.
Well, and
Misguided patriotism.
and you bring up some really good points. Obviously, the asbestos, the amount of asbestos that was in the buildings, the amount of time and money and effort it would take to, bring them down properly or renovate them.
Now,
Many
Rex, that
things.
doesn't mean it couldn't have happened. They could have
Sure.
dealt with the asbestos stuff. They
Well, of
could have dealt
course.
with the renovations. But the issue is, given the fact that we are talking major renovations, lots of costs. I'm not talking a couple $1,000,000. We're talking, huge amounts of money, and also lawsuits for people who had been exposed to the asbestos. It was just it was an easy sell to say, why don't we just use them? Those are those are the type of buildings we could use for this event. And why don't we just do it? I mean, it was, you can connect the dots yourself, sort of.
What's very interesting, though, is you can go back years and there is subliminal programming in not only TV shows and movies, but also cartoons of the Twin Towers going down before it actually happened. So,
Now
quite fantastic.
that may not be subliminal programming. That actually may be very primitive, spontaneous remote viewing, meaning some of these cartoonists just look up in the sky and sort of say, "What am I going to do next?" And they can actually say, "What about the Twin Towers collapsing?" And so, a lot of times people have these very primitive remote viewing images come in and they do something, and lo and behold, that's what happens. That doesn't mean that those people were working for the agencies and subliminally trying to program the public to prepare them. I'm not saying it. I'm not saying that's not happening. I'm just saying that there can be other reasons why that happens.
I would say maybe a combination of the two. I certainly wouldn't put it past that
Yeah,
you
yeah.
could have that type of, a vision where you see something happening and then it does. But clearly, for example, the Lone Gunman that came out 6 months, it was a TV show that came out 6 months before before 9/11, portraying the event actually happening pretty much identical to the way that it did. I would say there's a little bit more to that than just visualizing something because it wasn't a cartoon; it was a TV show. And it's been openly admitted that many of these agencies fund some of these Hollywood films and these TV shows. If you want to use the helicopters or certain equipment that the military has, well, they're going to have you say particular script, etc. But clearly both things could be the case. We
Well,
don't have.
actually, you raise a good point. The CIA, for example, vets, approves that type of thing. All movie scripts going back to say World War II, coming out of Hollywood, that involve any type of intelligence or war type stuff, aliens, UFO type stuff, anything dealing with CIA or NSA or anything, they vet and approve those things. And this is not in dispute. In fact, the main CIA operative who used to do this for 25 years retired recently, and it was, you know, broadly publicized that that's what his job was, to vet these scripts and offer changes and suggestions and things like that. And Hollywood dutifully obliged with all of these things, mostly dealing with UFO, alien, ET, as well as defense, intelligence, FBI, CIA, NSA type stuff, anything that the government would feel is sensitive. Now, I don't know who's doing that now, but the guy who was doing it for 25 years, he retired, and that was that. And he actually had a book where he was publishing about some of these things, and so that was he actually published a book about the about one of the very things that he was helping to cover up and that stuff. So this stuff, among people who do know about what agency activities are, it's not secret, and it has been well documented, and it's been covered in the major news. And yeah, they are involved in this type of stuff.
And obviously their best interests, if they're allowing a certain organization to use $50 million worth of equipment, they're going to try and get their money's worth. So
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
just people need to be aware of this, I feel. Now, let me ask you this. Ed Dames, he's very popular in remote viewing. He's on Coast to Coast quite frequently. For the past several years, he's claimed that there's going to be this giant kill shot that's going to take out, a ton of electronics and possibly people. Do you feel that Ed Dames is legit? And if so, why hasn't this kill shot happened yet?
You put me in an uncomfortable position because I don't talk about other people, and I specifically don't talk about people when I don't have anything positive to say.
Okay.
The only thing I will say to people about this so-called kill shot thing, I mean, I publicly don't talk about things like this. The only thing I would say about it is get something else you're interested in. It's just another example of fear porn, and don't stop planning on your next vacation or having a long life. I mean, this whole kill shot thing is just something that when you say he's popular, or that whole realm is popular in the remote viewing, I would very strongly disagree with you. There's a kill shot audience, people that listen to that stuff, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the community that is involved with remote viewing thinks there's anything to that. So what I would argue is that if your audience is worried about that, I would suggest to that element of the audience that they're addicted to fear porn, and that they should go see a therapist. They should try to get out of it. It's not particularly healthy, although it's very widespread. It's epidemic. Fear porn is throughout the news media, and so it's very easy for someone spreading fear porn to come up with stories like that. And when you said is popular, what you're really saying is fear porn that's being disseminated is being listened to by a lot of people. Well, what's new about that? That's what I was telling you earlier. If I had come up with a different 9/11 story offering fear porn about Islamic terrorists around your corner, it would have been covered by more people, and more people would be listening to it. People are addicted to fear porn. So, that's so with regard to the kill shot thing, I don't want to talk about that person. I don't want to talk about other people. I only like to talk about what we do, but I do like to address the fear porn idea.
Well,
Get a life. Get a life. Start thinking about something else. Start taking care of your kids. Feed them lunch. Plan on how you're going to be retiring. Stuff like that. Let's look at, for example, let's look at CNN right this very second. I just dialed CNN.com while we're talking. Okay. So let's look at the stories. I'm just reading the stories coming down. Okay. First, CNN poll. Voters are angry. Second, Hillary backpedals on a claim. Boehner, Bush would have punched Putin. The next one, the deadly virus that's not Ebola. The next one, the boy tests negative for Ebola in New York. The next one, U.S. general in Ebola quarantine. Do you get the idea?
well, it's
Then you get
fear
another one.
porn and it's
Hawaii,
ridiculous topics that don't
lava.
really
Hawaii,
matter.
yeah, but listen to the next one. Hawaii, lava flows up. Lava flow speeds up. Do you get the idea? U.S. citizen killed in West Bank. Another one, trapped in burning car. But then the next one, protester shoves the British prime minister. Every single one of them is like adrenaline jolt, adrenaline jolt, adrenaline jolt. There is a lot of stuff that's going on in the world that's interesting, that's nice, that's happy, that's good. That you don't get any of that going on. What you get is the portrayal that everything is in absolute chaos. And that's what's selling eyeballs when you get to this mass media. So this kill shot thing is just falling into all of that stuff as far as I am concerned. This is just my opinion. So I'm saying just my opinion. Now, this does not say that there will not be a corona mass ejection coming from the sun that will, affect life on Earth in a major way. NASA has gone on record as saying that is not an issue that's in doubt. It is going to happen. And so this whole this kill shot idea is not something that's impossible. It's going to happen. But you're asking, is it going to happen now, soon? It's going to happen eventually, but whether it happens 1,000 years from now, 500 years from now, 10,000 years from now, I mean, we have good historical records that coronal mass ejections have scorched the Earth before and knocked civilization down to its bare knuckles, and we've had to grow up again. For example, if you look at the ruins of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, this is something that has been talked about by academics such as the one who actually wrote a book called Forgotten Civilization. And let me get the, while we're talking, let me actually get his book out. Um, Robert M. Schoch, where he's a Boston University professor, and he's written extensively about literally stuff just like this, where a coronal mass ejection will happen, uh, literally plasma scorches the earth, and the ruins at Göbekli Tepe date back 10 to 12,000 years, and they are as complicated as the pyramids, and it's essentially a city that is buried, and the owners buried it on purpose. So obviously they were trying to protect themselves from something, and Robert M. Schoch goes through the evidence that suggests that they were protecting themselves from something coming from above. That means a solar type of thing. So these things do happen. The question is, are they going to happen right away? And do you need to pay for someone's expensive survival seminar in order to find the safe zones? I mean, the whole thing is
Right.
ridiculous.
Well, and we've only got about 3 minutes left here, but I'm definitely glad you brought that up. And not only that, if everybody feeds into this doom porn or this fear porn, and you've got 5 million, 10 million, 100 million people focusing their energy on something negative, that in return might cause something negative to happen faster. And are you still with us?
Well, yeah, this is the law of attraction. This is the idea that you get what you think about.
Right.
So
And you
fear
cry
porn
wolf.
yeah. Fear porn leads to more fear porn, leads to more fear porn, and so on. It's generally not a good idea. So my general advice to that question that you said is, get a life, start having happy thoughts, plan your next vacation, and by God, take care of your kids. Stop worrying about your shelters that you have to run to and your expensive seminars they have to take in order to prepare for the end of civilization, and start buying groceries for your kids, for heaven's sake.
Right, right. Focus on the now. Pay attention
Yeah.
to now. Be happy that you're here.
Buy textbooks, get your kids off drugs, get the grades up, stuff like that.
Right. Focus on the now. Well, Courtney, it's always great talking with you. For those that are listening, please check out Courtney's books and his work at CourtneyBrown.com, also farsight.org. A ton of information there, DVDs, books, good knowledge. You've even got free ebooks to download. So it's not like you're just trying to make money. I mean, you're definitely bringing out good knowledge that I feel everybody should know, that's looking for the truth, if they can stick their head out of the sand. And I'm glad we talked about people crying wolf so much. I mean, that's really important. You cry wolf so many times. When it's there, you're not going to care because you're going to be docile to it. So,
And we're not talking just fringe people. We're talking major media players crying
right.
wolf. Yeah, so that was a very important element and something that I've not covered in my other interviews. So I'm really glad you did bring it up, Rex.
Absolutely. What's next in the line for you guys?
Okay, now when I was asked previously if we'd ever do the 9/11 project, this is as after I was being interviewed about the Atlantis project or the Giza project, I swore to people on radio we would never do the 9/11 project. And that is because if I ever mentioned on radio or anywhere to anybody that we would ever do the 9/11, I came up with reasons for why we would never do it as well. Then I could never do the project, meaning I
Right.
had to convince these viewers that would never, ever happen, because otherwise they'd go to the very first target, see the Twin Towers come down and say, this is 9/11. And so they would have got the target right. They would have described the target, but that means they would no longer be doing anything blind. They have to have doubt. I mean, huge levels of doubt. And it worked throughout the entire data collection process. They were screaming, basically, this can't be 9/11. Courtney on radio, he's on record swearing he would never be that. What is this thing? So they just kept on. They didn't know what it was, and they kept blind, and they kept in doubt all the way to the very end. It worked like a charm. So now you're asking me what's next. So I'm giving you this I'm giving you this piece of information. If I told you, I'd be lying to you.
That's
Because
fair.
if I told you the truth, I could never do that.
Well,
Because
then,
the remote viewing has to be done under blind conditions. So I might as well just tell you I can't tell you. Uh,
can I can I recommend a few things before you go?
sure.
Okay. Sandy Hook, the Boston Marathon, um,
Then, if you want to get into some fringe stuff, how about the dark side of the moon? How about Phobos, Mimas, Iapetus, those what looks like artificial moons that orbit Saturn on the fourth rings? Maybe one of those things, possibly.
Actually, there's a lot of projects dealing with things like that that we've already done that are freely available on the Farsight Institute's website, farsight.org, F-A-R-S-I-G-H-T, like seeingfar.org, O-R-G, because we're a nonprofit. And for example, if you look at um, the project on an anomaly on Mars, uh,
The
and
pyramid.
also the pyramid, also the creation of the asteroid belt, where we actually had Iapetus as a target. So I mean, um,
Really? You had
yeah,
Iapetus
yeah.
as a target on that. I did not know
Well,
that.
the reason was it has a huge blotch on it that was caused by an explosion of a planet in the solar system that created the asteroid belt. And that explosion produced a shock wave that went throughout the solar system, and it hit Iapetus. And Iapetus is an icy moon that doesn't rotate, and so it held still while the shock wave went by it, and it left a dark splotch on top of it. Mainstream astronomers have all types of crazy reasons to try to explain it. It changes from time to time, and they say they have a new candidate, but the reality is it's very clear. And there was a very mainstream astronomer, head of his Department of Celestial Mechanics at the Naval Observatory, who collected a huge amount of data, planetary data, clearly indicating that there was an exploding planet, and the exploding planet caused the asteroid belt. But that contradicts so much of what mainstream people like to think, that only stars explode, but planets can't explode, that they basically ignored that. But nonetheless, the physical data support an exploding planet tremendously, and the remote viewing data do the same thing. Anyway, that's how that dark splotch on Iapetus came about. But anyway, that's available for free right on our website, farsight.org. So,
Fantastic. Well,
yeah,
wonderful. Dr. Brown, it was great to have you on. Look forward to speaking with you again, and maybe your next project you have coming up, let us know about it. And
that'd be
you take
great.
care.
Great, thanks.